Hey everybody, welcome to week 13 of the class. Congrats, you have made it through the first 3 quarters of the class and we got 4 weeks left to go. You turned in your concert report, so that's great. I know that that is a weight off. Please understand that it does take me a little while to get those graded. So you'll definitely know what you get before going into your final, but it'll take some time. I have a little more free time next week with the holidays, so my goal is to have those all graded by the end of that for sure, if not sooner. So anyways, yeah, you can keep an eye out for that. And so this week, we are going to focus on punk rock and new wave. And so as we have seen since after the British invasion, we've seen this continuing fragmentation, if you will, of rock music. You noticed I stopped using rock and roll for a while, and now we're talking about rock music. And so in all of its various permutations, one, I suppose, could, referred in pop and as well and all of that. I think I mentioned this maybe before, but I did have a student once who complained and said, there should be a pop music class. Well, yeah, pop and rock is a subset of pop, really, in a lot of ways. So at a certain point, you kind of, get into parsing out all these details. To me, really, it comes down to, and I know that this is subjective, but it really comes down to the fact that there are two kinds of music: good music and bad music. And now what falls into each category, of course, is going to be different for everybody when you get into the subjective aspects. And so speaking of that, when you went through progressive rock, I know that that was not everybody's favorite. And so that can be a bit challenging at times. Some of you definitely would put some of that into what you would consider to be bad music. I like the fact that the chapter ends on glitter rock, because that redeems it for a lot of people by the time you get to David Bowie and Queen. But when you're talking about progressive, the problem with having it in the same chapter is that then sometimes some people got confused on the assignments, even though I put in there, do not include glitter in this. But anyways, so now we're going to talk about punk rock and new wave, and those are different things. I'm gonna give you a heads up right now on something to think about with the assignments. So there is a tendency for some of you to, first of all, we got some of you that are still doing this without the book, and your grades are reflecting that. Also, we'll get some of you that are like, okay, how little amount of work can I put into this? I'm just going to read the introduction, and then I'm going to try to just riff off of that. And sometimes that backfires because the introduction is very general, or sometimes it even just is focusing on previous influences and not really talking about the meat of the material. That's just sort of leading you in and providing you with a bigger picture at times. So you do not want to use that to write your assignment if your goal is to get a good grade. If your goal is not to get a good grade, then you don't have to do anything, right? Then that's easy. If you want to get 0 points, that's not a hard thing to do. If you want to get full credit, then you got to put the work in, which means that you need to get through the material. And I know what's in the materials. I wrote all the study guides. I know what's going on, so it's important that you get through that so that we're all good. And again, if you're ever unclear on something, reach out to me. Send me a message, and I'll get back to you. You know that by now. So what happens when I talk about, I'll give, this is right now, this I believe this is still in the assignment. I retool these a little bit and try to make them better each time as we go. But I will ask about early punk bands. And what sometimes students will do is they'll talk about the early influences on punk as though those are the early punk bands, and they are not. So I'll give you an example. The early influences that led to punk rock, these were not considered punk rock, but led to it, certainly were the garage bands that we learned about, and you learn about the Kingsmen, Louie Louie, and all of those kind of things. But those early influences would be the Velvet Underground. Not so much musically, but aesthetically, their approach to their ability to play or not play their instruments, the fact of what they would write about. And if you think about early Velvet Underground was happening at the same time as the Beatles, the British invasion, other things that are going on, and whether you might have more stylized songwriting with the Beatles and even say Bob Dylan or other people like that. the Velvet Underground are writing really about gritty street life, stuff that's going on, poverty and drugs and sex and all sorts of things. So they're presenting a very different viewpoint from their music, and so they are definitely an influence, but they are not punk. So when I say who are the early punk bands, don't put Lou Reed. Don't put the Velvet Underground. Also, don't put Iggy and the Stooges or the MC5. Those are very important bands coming out of Detroit that led into punk rock, but they were not punk rock. Even the New York Dolls. There were things about the New York Dolls that aesthetically or musically or subject or look or whatever that all led into that. But they were not punk. Punk really kind of evolved in the mid-70s. There was a really important scene in New York based out of a club called CBGB's, and it was a really phenomenal time musically because you had the New York Dolls there, you had Television there, you had Patti Smith there, you had Blondie there, and you had the Ramones. And so what happened was you had this amazing scene of music because they were all very different. They didn't have, they weren't all doing the same thing. Nowadays, we hear so much of that. So you hear out of those influences, or out of that club, all of these amazing influences. And then a guy by the name of Malcolm McLaren, who was basically like a fashion guy from England, who had a shop in on the King's Road in London. And he witnessed what was going on in terms of music, in terms of fashion. And then he went back to England and he had a shop. It was it used to be like a Teddy Boy shop, a rock and roll kind of fashions. And he ended up changing into this, place called Sex that had all this, sexual type of stuff. But then he realized, hey, if we're gonna really push the fashions out, we need to do it through music, through a band. And that was how the Sex Pistols basically got started. These young kids were hanging out in his shop. They ended up running into John Lydon. They changed his name to Johnny Rotten. And you'll start to see in punk rock the change of all of these names, in terms of, that's became part of the punk rock ethos, as if you will. So that came out. So those are the early punk bands: the Ramones, the Sex Pistols. You'll read about some of the others. I'm not going to read them all out to you. So what happens is you have this sound that develops in New York. It makes its way to England. It becomes angry. The subject matter in England is very different than the subject matter here because they're dealing with a lot of poverty, a lot of unemployment. It was the monarchy, with the Queen and all that sort of stuff. And then it comes back over here to the States. They tour in 1978. The Sex Pistols were only around for around 2 years, if even that. And but their influence is really profound. And there were other British bands that were important too, like The Damned, and you're going to learn about some others. And then it comes back to the United States, and then all of these little punk scenes start to show up that are their own kind of club scene. And a couple things about the punk scenes in the different things. First of all, if you remember going back, we learned about independent music and 45s, singles, and that when they bands and artists back in the 50s and early 60s were really about recording singles. That happened again in the 70s with the punk scene. So a lot of these bands, the punk and new wave bands, would never get signed to labels. It was brand new. They didn't know how to make money off of it. The labels didn't. In a lot of cases, it was angry and foul and energetic. They had songs that were sometimes 30 seconds or a minute long. All of these issues going on. And so independent record labels started up. So, for example, one of my favorites, this is one of my favorite punk bands, is a band called X. And this is a single. This is their first 45 that they ever released on a small label called Danger House. And so the rise of the independent label became a big thing in the late 70s. And then that carried on through into the 80s and 90s when you hear about the whole indie band scene. This is really where a lot of that started. Eventually, a lot of the punk labels, punk bands themselves started their own labels. So Black Flag started SST, and Bad Religion started Epitaph. Dead Kennedys started Alternative Tentacles. So all of these labels started showing up. And we have kind of that now, even still. But this is the legacy of where that comes from. And so you had scenes that popped up, and there were scenes in Washington, D.C., scenes in San Francisco with the Dead Kennedys, with Crime, with the Avengers. And then there was a very important scene that developed here in Southern California that developed and evolved into hardcore punk. And here's where you get, the early punk bands, like say somebody like X, which was influenced by the punk energy, but also by rockabilly and other things. But then you had other bands like Black Flag and the Germs, the Circle Jerks, that were really what we would eventually call hardcore punk, that ended up getting angry, becoming like angry and violent, and it's a very complicated scene. If you ever want to know more about it, I think that I had these books up on my shelf behind me. Now I got like Jim Morrison staring over my shoulder. Sometimes these worked out thematically, and you got the Who. But there's a really interesting book. This is a book called Under the Big Black Sun, and it's a history of the LA punk scene, written primarily by John Doe, this guy right here, who is one of the members of X. That's X scene over there. And so this talks about the early scene through interviews with a lot of the people that were in the scene. It's really fascinating if this is your history. And then they came out with a second version called More Fun in the New World, which was kind of the unmaking of the LA punk scene. And that was really how it got influenced by a lot of the hardcore bands, either coming out of the Bay, not the Bay Area, but South Bay, or coming from Orange County. And so there is a lot of folks in that early LA, because a lot of it was based in LA. There was a lot of folks that believed that it was really when the Orange County bands, which you're going to learn about some of them, like Social Distortion and the Adolescents and all of that, but that started to change the scene. And then you're going to learn about New Wave. New Wave is different than punk. It is not the same thing. It is not a spin-off of punk. It is something totally different. And it is it's a very wide spectrum in terms of all of the things that are in it musically. And really, New Wave was kind of a catch-all term for all these bands that were showing up at the end of the 70s. And I focus mostly on that. The book goes a little bit more into the 80s and things change, but I'm focusing mostly on late 70s. And so stylistically, it's all over the place. And New Wave became a term where they didn't necessarily know how to describe what it was, and so it just kind of got lumped into all of this. K-Rock, back in the day when it was just a standalone independent radio station in Pasadena, was a big proponent of both punk and New Wave. New Wave really got started, if you will, in some ways by the band Devo. They're kind of the main ones, and you may know them from Whip It and things like that. But Devo started out of Ohio in 1976, thereabouts, and so you're going to learn about Devo, and then you're going to learn about Blondie and the Talking Heads. Both of those bands came out of the CBGB scene. You'll learn about some of the pub rock that became New Wave in England, like Elvis Costello, and you'll learn about the Pretenders. So you'll learn about a lot of interesting stuff. Most of what I focus on in here is really before MTV, but I do want to put that on your radar as we're getting close. MTV came on the scene August 1st, 1981, and that really changed the landscape musically. So you can really tell in terms of music and musical style, and the impact on whether something was before it or after it. And then I throw in a whole bunch of other favorites of mine. I love Oingo Boingo is one of my favorite bands, and other folks. So there's a lot of cool stuff to listen out there, and there's going to be a lot of familiar touchstones because some of these songs are still popular. So that's it. Have a great week. Do good work. Keep going strong. And as you know, there are questions buried throughout this. Make sure that you're getting to this early in the week, and we'll talk soon. That's it. Bye.